Funding for To the Contrary provided by the Cornell Douglas Foundation, committed to encouraging stewardship of the environment, land conservation, watershed protection, and eliminating harmful chemicals. Additional funding provided by the Wallace Genetic Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
Particularly with women's progress, is it all about having something to get really angry at before you can move forward?
It's a good question. I mean, what fuels progress? It's when you want to attain something, or when something's super bad and it happens in reaction to.
Welcome to the Contrary. This week we continue our series on women thought leaders, and today we speak with Amy Siskind, president of the New Agenda and author of The List. Welcome, Amy. Good to see you again.
Thank you for having me, Bonnie.
And we miss having you on the show. So tell me about The List. What is this?
This is a list of things that are atypical for a democracy. So it's not anything to do with the battles between Democrat and Republican. The constructs are things that are democracy versus the authoritarian state. Things that have been done from the beginning, shortly after the election, that are not typical or normal in our country. Starting with the first week with tweeting insults at the cast of SNL and Hamilton, starting the first week when there were a number of a spike in hate crimes, and Trump saying we should grant acceptance to others as opposed to condemning. So these are things I captured as the weeks go on, sort of as a way for us eventually to find our trail back to normalcy and democracy.
How do most people receive it? Because he did win the election, even though she won the popular vote. And there are a lot of people out there who, he still got 42% approval rating, and it's going up recently.
So the things I'm capturing are not opinion, they're just things that are atypical, and they're just noted in a very sort of flat, factual kind of way with footnotes for each item. For example, information on breast cancer was wiped off a website, and that's a common theme throughout the weeks. He makes information disappear, and then when you don't have information, you can then take away regulations with the environment or rights and protections for marginalized communities and women because you're making them invisible.
Tell me how the effect of his administration, what's it having on poor women, on women of color, on the LGBT community, all the diverse communities we have in this country?
It's impacted everybody who's not white, straight, Christian, and male. He's certainly going after immigrants the hardest, and not trying to get rid of immigrants, trying to block refugees, and very successfully so, unfortunately. But the Muslim ban was one of the first things he did, the transgender military ban, wiping the LGBTQ community out of the census. With women, one of his first acts was a swift version of the global gag rule. He has less women in his administration than in any time since Reagan, and pays them less than even before Reagan. So I think pretty much—
Pays them, what do you mean pays them
his
less?
Employees, 63 cents on the dollar, the women that work in his White House versus the men. What he basically does, and this is the way he won the election, uses picking on others or marginalized communities and women as sort of fuel to keep his base together. Anytime that he seems to be floating off and not controlling the narrative, all of a sudden you'll have the NFL anthem, or the transgender military ban. He sort of invents these shiny coins that are a way to keep his base engaged against the others. It's a way of uniting his base, which is what authoritarians do in sort of the rise of white nationalists. They sort of target everybody else and use that as a fuel, that hatred as a fuel, to keep themselves in power, which is one of the two things he's trying to do, whatever it takes to stay in power, and then the second thing, make money.
Do you think, are we living in an authoritarian state right now?
We're moving towards that rapidly. The book is week 1 through 52, but I continue to track it at theweeklylist.org. At week 67, there was a shift, and where he basically has become unshackled and it's truly seizing power. If you think about what's happening now, he's going after Amazon because he feels like it. He wants to go after the Washington Post, and his friends in real estate don't like that their malls aren't doing well. The week before it was China tariffs. And then in the executive branch, there's still a third of key roles that have no nominee. And his inner circle has had more turnover than any administration in his first 14 months. And more recently, he doesn't seem particularly to care about replacing them. He's even talking about becoming his own chief of staff. So
he's talked about that?
Yeah, his friends have told him he can do a fine job. So he's feeling very confident now. He's still got the anger, but he's got a certain self-assuredness now, and there's no checks or balances. I think the one thing that we've learned as a country in high school history, you learn that there are checks and balances in our government, and those are more norms rather than laws, because the Republican Party is doing nothing to put him in check. If you think about what's happening now, week by week, he's just throwing up stuff that in traditional days, the Republicans, if Obama had put tariffs on China or said he would meet with Kim Jong-un, there would be a Republican at every mic on Capitol Hill screaming bloody murder. Trump does it, nothing.
You say in the book that you had to hire an armed guard to stay at your house. Do you still have that person there?
One thing that came with this list was much more visibility for me personally, and now I have 250,000 Twitter followers. And the week after Charlottesville, when the Daily Stormer wrote a particularly horrible article about the martyr who had been killed in that, in the protests, Heather Heyer, I wrote something to the web hosting company of the Daily Stormer saying that they should be taken down. And GoDaddy responded to me. It went viral. They responded and they took down their website. And gradually all the other web hosting companies took down their website. And so they posted my home address and phone number. So that week I did have I started getting calls. And
how, they, as I mentioned earlier, 42% approval rating. That's pretty high.
Well, for him, it's high.
Right, for him. Well, it seems like a bigger number than one would think.
Yes.
So, how do you deal with the reaction you get from the alt-right? And tell me about. Do they threaten your life?
No, and I think there's. Out of that 42%, I think there's probably a fair amount of just complacency and just normalization, which happens in authoritarian regimes. You don't, the rise of Hitler or the rise of authoritarian, most of the country just kind of wants everything to be okay. So I've actually been very pleasantly surprised at what has now become the resistance, how many people are engaged that aren't necessarily politically involved people, that are just upset about the fabric of our country changing. And so people are engaged and they're doing various acts, whatever that may be, to fight for our democracy. Like, this isn't Republican versus Democrat. This is a fight for democracy and our values. So in answer to your question, I've been in women's rights for a long time. I'm used to having people come after me, for whatever reason. I'm a gay woman, so pretty thick skin. But no, and I'm actually heartened that people are tweeting me that are conservative, saying they're buying the book because it's history. Like, there's not opinions in there. So it's really like understanding what's happening in our country, because in the chaos, it's impossible to keep track.
Has Trump given up fighting back against Hillary, whom he obviously beat in an election a year and a half ago?
He's still attacking her, still calling her crooked Hillary. He was calling Obama cheating Obama. They're sort of, part of his battle against the others. It's sort of, in an authoritarian regime, you have these flags that you fly that you then shoot down to keep your people engaged.
It was publicized during the campaign that
Yes.
his first wife, when they divorced, in divorce papers, said that he kept a copy of Mein Kampf by his bed and read it every night. Is he doing this on purpose, do you think? The White House is so often described these days as chaotic. Is he creating chaos on purpose? Does he have a plan? Or is this just off the top of his head?
Cambridge Analytica, when they started to talk about our election and Bannon and Mercer started to organize, they tested certain words and ideas, and one was deep state, and one was an authoritarian strongman. How would that test with the American people? And then they sort of went out to try to cast that role. And they tried with Cruz first, and then when he didn't work out, Trump hired Cambridge Analytica, which is a whole other topic. But so I do think that there was a sort of Manchurian Candidate kind of aspect to it, that our country was ripe for a strong man to come in, because there's been a lot of dissatisfaction in our country, a lot of parts of our country that feel ignored or marginalized. So our country was ripe for it, and he stepped right into that role and knew what notes to play, even if subtly, you know, that it's the people of color and these immigrants that are coming in to take your job. It's the women that are taking your job. Let's make America back to the 1950s when white, straight male, Christian male could have a job and a good family income. So that's the underlying message that worked. But I think naturally from the time that he took office in the book, when he, in the first weeks, you won't remember this, but he wasn't sure if he was going to be part of NATO anymore. You remember that? You know, and he's still subsequently, like when Merkel was in the White House and he wouldn't shake her hand. All of our traditional allies, he called Turnbull in Australia and started screaming at him because he didn't want to take the refugees. You know, ally by ally, he's alienated our allies. And meanwhile, he's had an open door policy for Turkey's Erdogan to come to the White House, Egypt's El-Sisi. He likes the way Duarte is doing such a great job with, you know, the drug war. We should try that here, have capital punishment. And of course, Putin. So he definitely has an affinity for strongmen. Those are his compatriots.
Poland, I think, was the first place he visited in Europe.
Yeah, because he was supposed to go to the UK and they were going to have protests. And actually, that's in the book. In Poland, they agreed to bus people in so his rallies would be full. And then he gave one of his dystopian, you know, speeches about the refugees coming in and stealing our countries, and you know, the same one he gives here.
How much cultural impact does this administration have, particularly on little girls of all colors?
I worry about what our kids are ingesting. I mean, if you think about the news and what we're normalizing away from all the political stuff.
Are the media normalizing it?
Yes.
How would you have it be different? How would you have the media treat him if you were Tsarina of America?
They are improving in the early few months of his regime. Anytime he would do something normal, it would be like, now he's become presidential. He would read a speech off a teleprompter, and they would be like, oh, he's finally come to the other side. What I would want to tell the media is, from the first week of the list till today, he's doing the same exact things. This man has not changed. He's not going to change. He doesn't have good intentions for our country. He doesn't care about norms. He doesn't care about our democracy. And he doesn't care about the people that voted for him. So cover what he's doing in the context of it being not normal. You know, you don't call former presidents cheating. So I think our media has not been able to hold him into account. And I understand what they're doing and what he's causing them to do, because he understands if he keeps throwing these shiny coins and changing the subject, they can't cover what he's actually doing. But what I think the list is so valuable in part, and I know a lot of people in the media read it, because there'll be weeks in the list where there's 150 items and 20 to 30 have gathered 80% of the attention from the media. And there's all these other stories, you talk about the kids, that are impacting the fabric of our country that are getting no coverage, or just one story local coverage.
Give me some examples of what you're talking about, things that haven't been widely covered but are really hurting people, and because of our particular interest, women. I mean, have hundreds of thousands of people been thrown off federal programs, and they're losing their food stamps, or they're losing their Section 8 housing. What's going on with all that?
Yeah, so one of his first acts when he took office, his second executive order was a global gag order that, an extreme version of it, signed in a room of all white men. And almost without exception, the things that he and his regime have done have been thought out by and completed by a group of white men. So
but
increasingly,
but they were going after Planned Parenthood big time.
That's a Republican thing.
He lost on that. I mean, they're still fully funded in the federal, appropriations bills.
Yeah. So I view, when you talk about women, there's a lot of different elements of it, but I believe the importance of, because of the work I do, women's faces. When you talk about the impact of girls, if you don't have any women in the decision making in healthcare, like you had these rooms of all white men when they were talking about their healthcare bill and what should be in the one that passed in the House, about maternity leave, about what part of childbirth should be reimbursed, then that decision making is flawed. So the fact that he has so few women in ranks of power is shockingly, it's shock.
It seems to me like the millennial generation, when they were young, and now that they're in their 20s and 30s, they were told they could do anything. The world was their oyster, and they were fully empowered, and that's essentially how they've been living their lives. Is that going to change with the next generation?
Yeah, so I think what happened is, in the beginning of his regime, there was so much of this kind of stuff happening that there was a implosion, which is the Me Too movement. And the early acts,
you think he directly caused that?
I do. I credit him. People will ask me what he must have done something good in his first year, and I think he unleashed a movement which, for those of us who have been in the advocacy for women for decades, it's been very slow progress, and now it's just like kaboom. And ultimately, it could be what brings him down. Not Stormy Daniels and sexual misconduct per se, but the payments associated with it and the cover-up, or the other woman coming forward. But I think within a number of industries, including here in Washington, D.C. in politics, but starting in Hollywood, but all over, there's this new awareness that it's not okay. And I think it was so bad with him in those early months, the way women were disrespected and not included, that it was like lighting a stick of dynamite.
Do you think that the gun control movement will morph into actual gun control laws being approved?
Yeah, I do. You have to sometimes take a step back in progress and have things get to where they are now, where we're revisiting half a century ago to sort of catapult forward. I believe both of these movements are historical in nature. The marches, the number of people showing up twice for the Women's March, and then for the kids in DC, but as well the walkouts that they did at their high schools. My son led one of those, and it was 1,200 people in our community signed up on his Facebook page. I mean, these were huge. So these kids are going to vote. So it's going to have profound change. Because the kids are growing up, they never understood there being anything wrong with people that were gay or transgender. You see such a disparagement between older people's voting patterns and younger. It's going to have a change in our voting patterns for a while.
And what do you foresee in November?
Another bloodbath.
A blue wave?
Yes.
A really strong one.
Yeah, and I think it's underestimated because I think people don't understand the nature of what happened in November 2017 because our media refuses to cover what has become the resistance, which are people that are not politically involved, who are now involved.
Why do you say the media isn't covering the resistance?
Well, the Tea Party, the word Tea Party was used in the media. If you had 20 white guys show up in a room, it was front page of the New York Times. You had 1 million women show up to march for a second time, it's still not called the resistance. It will be known as the resistance, but there's no equivalent, the resistance. And because of that, the media totally missed what happened in November 2017. And that was largely women coming out to vote who are not, they call them college suburban women, but these are women who, and I know many of them, who never show up for elections to vote and now showed up because they care about what's happening to our country more broadly. They care about what our children are exposed to. So it's not that's what the Republican Party needs to be careful about. These are people that were on the sidelines politically who are now going to be part of politics.
Particularly with women's progress, is it all about having something to get really angry at before you can move forward, get the momentum together to move forward?
It's a good question. I mean, what fuels progress? It's when you want to attain something, or when something's super bad and it happens in reaction to. And both of the movements now, I believe, are in reaction to. People showing up to march, and again, people who are never, I've been politically involved, are showing up because they're concerned for our country. And, so I think it's a reaction to, which is fine. I mean, our country, progress isn't really linear. It's all, we jump backwards and we take 2 steps forward. And I think that's what we're seeing now.
Are you surprised there weren't riots in the streets? Particularly around, for women, to have a president who has said the things he said about women, the Billy Bush tape, and all the other things he's done, and
I'm concerned about what we've normalized, because this is on like 60 Minutes, which is at Sunday at 7 o'clock when people's kids are still awake, and they have to explain that a person who is sitting in the White House, they have to explain to their kids what it's unavoidable. I mean, the amount of viewership. So it's hard to not be concerned about what our children are ingesting, or what they see in school, the stuff that you hear anecdotally about kids being called Pocahontas, and because they're Indian American, or whatever, the insults going back. And it's in the list week after week. The amount of hate crimes are up significantly. The anti-Semitism, the xenophobia, the bigotry. So how can it not impact our country? We're in a very dire time. Like, we can talk about the hopeful parts, which are the Me Too movements and the teens, but where we sit today, we are in serious trouble of losing our democracy as we know it. There's no other way to put it.
People who would say to you, that's a way overreaction. What do you say to them? They're not paying attention.
They're not paying attention. I think there's a natural desire to have things be okay, and those are perhaps some of the people that are now joined in the 42%, but there's a lot of people that are awakened and involved and outraged and not sleeping at night and having panic attacks. Like, you wake up every morning, like, what's he going to tweet today? What's he going to do? What's he going to take away today? What's he going to do?
Tell me. But there was an article in the New York Times about people being more upset people who paid attention to the news for the last year and a half, being more depressed, being more upset, anxiety, etc.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, I think Trump hasn't changed, but the American people have changed, because we've had to digest what's happened in our country day in, day out, and sort of like every day, like whether it's Pruitt or DeVos, there's scandals within his regime week by week, and they just get away with it. Kushner is raising money overseas. Donald Jr. is going over to India because they're having problems with a real estate deal, and he's a spokesperson for the U.S. Ivanka and Jared are using their personal emails, putting them on the Trump org server. So these things happen. Comey gets fired, that's the end. And then it's never the end. And then the next day there's 5 more. So I think our country, a lot of our country who's paying attention, and people are paying attention, are living in a state. An interesting anecdote was people who are in the psychologists say, not since 9/11 have so many patients come in to talk about one topic. And it's conservatives as well, because they feel like in their family, if they voted for Trump, that they're getting scorned for that. But it's mostly people that are worried. They're worried about our country. They're worried about themselves.
How much do you think Trump's election was a reaction against 8 years of Obama?
Well, he ran on, the birther idea, the fact that a black man could be in power, and now we're going to have a woman in power. There's a base of our country, maybe his 35%, that are going to be with him no matter what, because he's fueled them on the basis of We want old America back, which is white, straight, Christian, male America, and everybody else is sort of on the outside. They don't like the fact that gay people can get married, or that the millennial generation is diverse. So there's a backlash to that, and he plays off it nonstop. He knows that it got him, where he is now, legitimately or not, and that's what he keeps fanning. Each week there's a new, shiny coin. If you read the book, it's these unusual things. He'll be having a bad week, and all of a sudden he's tweeting about a transgender military ban. No rhyme or reason. Or burning the American flag. That's in one of the early weeks of the lists. No rhyme or reason. It was just wanted to change the subject.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. This has been an enlightening conversation, and anybody who can get through this very thick book will learn a lot when they read it. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the Cornell Douglas Foundation, committed to encouraging stewardship of the environment, land conservation, watershed protection, and eliminating harmful chemicals. Additional funding provided by the Wallace Genetic Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more PBS.